Hi, Wendy.
Hey Joe,
How's it going?
it's Thursday. It's been snowing. I've got a
Yeah.
cold, a cough drop in my mouth, but it's good. How about you?
Oh, sounds exciting. Yeah, I live in Salt Lake City. It's been dumping here.
It's always snowing.
Yeah, it always snows here. But the nice thing is, like, from where I live, about 15 minutes from here, you can get to a lot of ski resorts, so it's pretty easy. But
So you go hang out with Jepson all the time then? He's in Salt Lake, isn't he?
he is, but we don't see each other that often. We see each other probably more overseas than we do in Salt Lake, which is kind of tragic. But
Interesting. Maybe you need to
so
change that. That should be a New Year commitment, right?
one of us should just move into each other's homes, and we'll just like be roommates, and then we'll solve that problem. So.
I think that'd be interesting. You guys could do a show. We'll pay subscription to watch.
That'd be a hilarious show for sure. But before I creep out everybody in the show, just kidding. Um, for people who don't know who you are, Wendy, do you want to give a quick intro?
Yeah. So I am Wendy Turner Williams. I am, a longtime data executive. I've been in cloud since before there was cloud, because I started in telecom like a long time ago before cloud was a word. And basically, I have spent a lot of time in the big tech industry at some of the biggest software brands in the world, like Microsoft and Salesforce and Tableau, as chief data and AI officer.
Very, very cool. Very, very cool. Yeah, and yeah, quite a storied career actually. I mean, walk me through maybe the progression of sort of maybe the different transition points you've seen. 'Cause
Yeah, my career has been odd, I guess. I like to say I've been very lucky, maybe, or I've noticed when the opportunities were there. But my background, I wasn't a STEM student. I didn't have an engineering degree. I had a history degree. I started at a telecom company, basically doing analytics and finance, and that led to the engineering partner team recruiting me over to engineering within the first year of me joining my professional career. And I've been in engineering ever since. Since then, I've done everything from I've been doing digital transformations for years.
Mm.
Like when I first started in telecom, we were still on a mainframe. Not to date myself, but I'm a little older, so we were on a mainframe. So moving those onto, on-prem database, built the first data warehouses at some of the biggest telecom companies out there. Even doing things like taking their maps of where they actually have a lot of their infrastructure as far as fiber, where they used to have whole floors and buildings that had these big, huge city maps that they pull out once there was a call before you dig type of call, and
Hmm.
took a lot of that stuff and converted it and digitized it against this new thing called I just went completely blank. The satellite. What's the satellite stuff?
GPS.
Yes,
Yeah.
against that, taking those things and digitizing that and actually putting it in the hands of the field versus people having to roll out maps. Like that was early, like before even 2000, I was doing things like that. So
It's crazy.
since then, I've done everything from help Microsoft convert from box product mentality to the cloud.
Mm.
Engineering fundamentals for Azure and all the data platforms that people use. um,
Yeah.
Helping those software companies actually understand the audiences that they're targeting, right? A lot of software companies, they build software and they have devs, but they don't do the job of their customer zeros. So companies like Microsoft, who have a lot of data products, I'm running data internally at Microsoft, and I'm having to build where their products don't fit my need or where there's gaps, and then helping to educate them on why that is, and shift a lot of those tools into the product space to help other customers. I've kind of it's been an interesting place. I would just say
Yeah.
that my role has not always been pure data. My role has been a lot about how's data used and what's the end-to-end process to create, capture, visualize, use in models data, and what's the tools that we need, and educating software companies on that for a very long time. So
Yeah.
I'm like the customer zero of the customer zeros for a lot of the big tech companies.
That's really interesting. And so you've probably seen probably the progression of how data has been used. Um, What stands out to you? Because I mean, data used to seem like it was this back office IT function for a lot of companies, and now it's the cool thing. And now with AI, it's like
The Uber, yeah, it's
yeah,
Nirvana, right? Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's been very interesting. It's hard for me. My experience around data may be very different than others, because I think it's data is unique per industry that you're in, or even the company site
Hmm.
you work at, right? Just depending on the type, but. For me, since I've always worked in big tech related companies, I've always been around data, big data. I mean,
Right.
even back in the late 1990s. So I think one of the first things was, how do you actually transition off of these on-prem into, mainframe type of, components into a self-service type of mentality where data could become a lot more democratized. I think that was really what first started happening in the late 90s. I think after that, you started having a lot of the cloud services, right? I mean, for me,
Hmm.
especially, it was a huge jump when I went from telecom, or there was a point in time I was at Nordstrom over to
Oh,
Microsoft. And when I was in Microsoft, I was in Bing and MSN, which meant it was super big data because it was all real time search and
yeah.
advertising, and it was all cloud. Okay, before Microsoft even had cloud. Okay, because they built their first internal cloud services to support MSN and Bing, etc. So we were pumping just massive amounts of data. The amount of data management needed to support things like you've got marketing teams who are doing channels and advertising to the search algorithm teams and actually making sure that the searches are landing right to monetize against the advertising, to devices, because that was right when Microsoft bought mobile and some other things, and how would that experience on mobile, or how would they bleed that into their office tools or their other tools to kind of extend it across all their devices, including Xbox. It was very, very, what do I want to say, a lot of innovation, even in the mid to late 2000s, that a lot of companies still haven't seen today, right? That I saw 15
Hmm.
years ago, like generative AI. That's a good example. I led voice of the customer for Microsoft for like 2 years. Okay. And that was my first role at Microsoft. And what we did at that point in time is we did sentiment analysis. Okay. We
Hmm.
were building all types of models and engines and stuff to basically go and scrape, okay, verbiage out of websites on within Microsoft itself, on your bills, etc., on industry websites related to not just Microsoft but others, to basically generate what the sentiment was and feed it back to product teams so that they can improve the product, right? And improve the marketing. That was all very early on generative AI, because we were aggregating it into actual statements, and we were
Hmm.
annotating a lot of our metrics, et cetera, at that point in time. So, things like generative AI are not new, per se. I think a lot of companies have been working in this space for a long time. I think that now it's just matured to the point that you don't have to be an expert in these spaces to actually be able to leverage generative AI. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And in the past, we had to do a lot around the training and the models and everything to actually get it to work. But that's some of the durations I've seen, is just the volume, just explosion. The use of it to actually drive mega multi-billion-dollar companies. Those companies themselves shifting from their own product mentalities into how do we enable everyone in this space from a cloud perspective. I've been there for all of that and working within those companies around that.
What do you think about the big boom in AI right now?
I think it's interesting. I think there's a couple of things. Everyone's AI, but all they're really
Hmm.
thinking about is generative AI, and generative AI
Yeah.
is one form of AI, right? Number one.
Yeah.
So I think people don't understand what AI is, to be honest. AI is not just generative AI. I think that people aren't ready for it, to be honest. Back to, they don't understand it.
Mm.
So they don't understand how it works. Right. So things like we're seeing on the news around Samsung, releasing secrets because they deployed it, or the copyright lawsuits happening, or even like United Healthcare, right? And
Right.
the bias pieces that come out of their models. There's been a lot of focus in the last many years around data. Anyone in our space knows that data is talked about in every single meeting we go to, every conference we go to, etc. But the reality is that most companies have really data is like this four-letter word. They see
Hmm.
a metric and they're like, oh, we're data driven. Right? There's a metric, there's a report, that we've got data. And it's like, you don't understand what actually went into creating that metric in the processes. And by the way, just because you have the metric, is that the metric you actually need? Like, what's our
Mm.
strategy and what's the actual business questions we should be asking to move our strategy? Not we just have a metric and so that means that we're good, right?
Right.
So back to AI, there's so much data debt and there's so much
Mm.
lack of knowledge about the data that companies have and how it could be used from an AI perspective without any human oversight on top of it, that it's actually somewhat dangerous, right?
Mm.
Um, some of it could be even life or death questions, right? For diagnostics. Some of it could be, again, you're your own bad actor because you've got so much data debt that you've not actually taken care of. And once you remove the tribal knowledge and the human aspect of it, if you don't understand that it's there, it's going to be high risk. It's kind of like it's not my circus, not my monkeys. I'm like, well, no, it's going to be a lot of people's AI circus, and it's a lot of their AI data monkeys that are going to be running around, and hopefully you won't be on the news. You know what I mean?
Oh
And there's,
boy. It's
I think
well,
there's a reason for that. If I can take that a little bit further,
oh yeah.
there's been a lot of regulations, right, in the last many years, right? Cyber is rising. Once clouds happened, then cyber really kind of took off. And any of us who work in data know, it's been, I think the data people have been a little irritated, actually, that cyber's gotten so much budget and so much attention when cyber is about protecting the data, right? And there's a lot we can do actually in the data designs or in the data architecture to help be proactive against those types of cyber threats. Or then the privacy split up, right? When GDPR started hitting, I think data people really thought we would data down at that point in time. But what happened was people started spinning up privacy silos.
Right.
Now you've got the privacy teams basically focusing on one dimension of data, right? Versus thinking about it as there's lots of dimensions of data. And there's lots of ways to put in really good, mature data management processes that allow you to manage and understand your data at any point in time. And as any law comes up that's a silo or a use case or a new technology, you to manage that effectively based on what's happening in the market or the need. And most people didn't do that type of foundational work. And to me, that's the risk with AI, right?
Mm.
If you didn't do that, you just don't know. Executives don't know their data anyway, unfortunately. But the data teams do, and they've often been underfunded, understaffed, or don't have the right infrastructure to actually manage data for data, if that makes any sense,
Hmm.
from an engineering perspective.
It's an interesting one. I mean, I've been talking to more and more CDO, CAO, and people like Randy Bean as well. So I was
Yep.
talking to him yesterday, actually, and it's interesting because it feels like this has been AI has been the mandate, maybe from the CEO and the board down.
Yep.
But the executives I talked to, I mean, they got to this position for a reason. It's not because they're woefully unaware of the pain points of data. Hopefully, at least. But what do you advise? Or how would you advise a CEO or a board that wants to dive into AI,
Yeah.
come hell or high water, and
Yeah.
nothing we can do about it? What
Well,
would you tell
so
them?
there's several things I would tell them. I actually have a packed report that's coming out on this in, like, I think it's mid-February to end of February, called Unleashing the Power of Data with Generative AI. And I talk about 7 steps. It is
Hmm,
directed to boards, by the way. This book is
nice.
directed to board of directors and to executives. And I talk about there's really 7 steps to ready for AI. And it doesn't have to be for generative AI. It could be about anything. The first one is making sure you have the right accountability models, right? Form an AI task force, and that task force should report into the CEO and the board. Okay, this should be a board directive. Board members have to have accountability related to AI because it has so much risk. And it's a new type of risk landscape that they're not used to when it comes to ethics and bias, etc. Okay. It also needs dedicated funding, right, in order to actually clean up some of those foundational components that they'll have to. The next piece outside of the accountability models is around making sure you actually understand and know where to apply and start your AI journey. Okay. What's your business strategy? What's your data strategy? And what's your infrastructure strategy? If it's generative AI, I would only be focused on putting generative AI where you have very, very mature business processes with mature actual analytics. Because again, it takes data and it ingests it and just spits it back out, right? It's just eating and spitting out what is being fed. So you want to make sure you know the accountability models of the particular outcome. You want to know what to expect as far as the data itself, and you want to make sure that's very mature. So I would be starting there, and you would need to look at your actual strategies in order to do that, because you need to measure them across the board. Maybe you have a mature business process that doesn't have mature data, right? And maybe the infrastructure is a mess outside of even generative AI. All of these things have to work together in order to support generative AI. Beyond that, I think people have to do almost like a data maturity, so a deeper data maturity. So think like a CDAM, right? Like a cloud data management framework assessment, like a light one, right? Where you're actually trying to understand what's the quality related to this data, just to have the right policies in place, right? In order to actually manage it effectively. Do we know who the stewards are so that if it goes ballistic or there's problems, like who's accountable for addressing these things? There's some kind of, boilerplate types of things that you need to understand about the data to assess that. And then, it kind of continues on from there. But the next one would be around risk landscapes, right? Like a huge one that I think most people never think about is around bias. Bias is usually a quality problem, okay? You don't have enough representation within your data sets. And so with the models and with generative AI, it's going to skew towards a bias direction. Now, because you didn't have the right representation in your data sets, maybe that hasn't impacted your business today, right? Because you were looking at it from a generative AI outcome and actually explaining different types of personas or representations, etc. But now that you are using generative AI and it can generate that type of output without any type of mindset, it's a blind gap. And most people don't have balanced data sets. In fact, there's whole businesses that their entire business model is built on being biased, right? Like think Fox News versus CNN, right? Like they're going to have very, very different representation in their models based on who they target, right? Or think some of these, again, this is how they build their business. So it's going to get really interesting to watch things like bias and or quality of data and the impact of the outcomes and how that's going to go through courts, because it may shift how businesses how to think about what they capture or how they even, augment these things, or how they, again, make that more equal from a representation perspective if others use their content or their data. Copyright's the other big one, right? I know universities for years have taught that if it's created by a machine, it's not copyrighted. It can't be copyrighted. But now you have, New York Times, or you've got the Game of Thrones, gentlemen suing, etc. Because, if you're taking entire statements of copyrighted material, it's just a different world. And the regulations are not set up in the right way to handle this. The laws are not set up in the right way to handle this. People don't have the right data management to even know if it's copyright or if they have bias or anything else. And so it's going to be very interesting.
It will be. Any thoughts on the EU AI Act?
Yeah, I think the EU is going to be the one to really kind of watch and follow. I think I like the approach that they're going down towards systems. I think when I compare that with the EO, I think let me extend out a little bit broader.
Yeah.
I don't think that there's ever going to be an AI sheriff, right? I don't think the
Hmm.
EU is going to be an EI sheriff, or I don't think the executive orders or the US is going to be an AI sheriff, because I think that's not how data works. Number one, the way that the regulations are written is kind of like, a paragraph on a piece of paper that most companies, including software companies, and because I know this because that's where I worked, take that regulation and they go interpret it, and they then try to define how they're going to implement it, which
Hmm.
means every single company basically does a different interpretation and implementation, which means the regulation itself is not very sticky because it's not been implemented in the same way. You can
Yeah.
look at GDPR as an example of that. I led GDPR controller at Microsoft, and then I led GDPR readiness at Salesforce.
Mm.
Very, very different approaches, okay, to doing this. So, number one, I think it's a great start. Do I think it's going to actually create quality, ethical AI future? No, I think it's giving some bumpers, but I think that depending on how each company interprets this,
Hmm.
is how it's going to land or not land.
Oh
I
yeah.
also think that when you think about the EU versus the executive order, any large enterprise, they have data that is spanning the globe, right? You've got geo-residency data handling. You've got state laws versus federal laws. You've got the EO coming out, but then you've got New York AI, you've got California AI, you got whatever. It just goes to show you that there is a gap in these regulations where they're not effective, because each state, each city, each country shouldn't have to create their own regulations,
Hmm.
because data is flowing across these states and these boundaries anyway into most companies. Okay. So they're just not very, very effective. They're not tactical. What I think is that, we need to get double down on that data, like I talked about. We need the data
Yeah.
down. And frankly, the regulations are ignoring the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is the data itself and the data
Hmm.
management processes. And that's what needs to be regulated, is the data management processes, so that these paragraphs, as they're applied, have the foundations that can actually be applied in order to meet what that use case ask is. And
Hmm.
until that happens, these are pointless, in my opinion. They're pointless.
Yeah. Well, especially the Biden executive order is interesting because I mean we're in an election year right now, and that could just
Mhm.
be overturned. Like I don't know, next year.
Yep.
So I'm wondering how many companies are actually looking at it. Like, yeah, I'll get around to that. Probably next year. So you got a lot
No,
of time.
I think that's spot on. Plus, it's evolving, right? The EO is mostly a NIST ask, okay, which is cyber.
Yeah.
Most of the concerns that are hitting the news around AI are not cyber. They're, again, the quality of the data,
Hmm.
the data itself, which is not anything that NIST is going to actually go and manage. I'm not saying
Yeah.
there's not cyber risk related to AI. Of course there is. Again, people are trying to get to the data within it.
Yeah.
But AI really focuses on the data itself, and none of the regulations are focusing in that particular area. It's like the word ethics, right? I bet
Hmm.
ethics may mean something to you that's different from, say, another person down the hall. You know what I mean? Like,
Oh yeah.
everybody has a different interpretation of ethics. So
Well,
again, writing a law that says you must be ethical, well, every company is going to go and interpret that in a very, very
oh yeah.
different way.
Well, every country will too. As I always point out, I mean, I used to go to China a lot, and it's like China has a way different view of ethics and AI than we do.
Oh,
If you don't think so, then go over there and find out. It's a complete 180.
well, which is
So
kind of my point, right? Like,
yeah,
I want to
exactly.
say, here's what ethics means. I want to say that, look, there's certain things you can put in place so that you understand what it is you're collecting, how it's
Yeah,
being used, what it's supposed to be used for based on those use cases, who's responsible for it, and different types of quality bars, even around things like bias and representation, etc., or lineage or
yeah.
contracts and all. there's ways to do these things to where you can spin based on any law and any interpretation of what ethics is. What I'm personally trying to do on this front, let me tell you this.
Yeah.
I feel so strongly about this ethical quality AI future, and that the regulations are missing the mark, and that having the big 7 tech companies up on the hill having conversations is the wrong approach, because they don't own the data they have, and no one's on one infrastructure set. You've got hundreds of business applications stored. You've got in and out. It's no one's on one set. That what I've done is I've started a global nonprofit called the Association.ai.
I was about to ask you about this one. Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
The Association.ai, where I'm focused on creating a safe, neutral platform for the people that are the AI implementers. So anyone who works in the fields of AI, data, ethics, privacy, robotics, and security, that they have a community, that they can have crowdsourcing of best practices, that they can have jobs and marketplaces and certifications to help them do their job, so that they can more effectively drive the conversation in their company. Because like you're saying, there's China, who has a completely different take. Within China, compare 10 companies. Each one of them probably has a different take on what ethics means to them per company, right? So when it comes to quality and ethics, as far as a sheriff, there's not a sheriff. There's not one sheriff, but there's lots of deputies. And it's people who are the AI implementers, right? And helping them to understand what can be done, what are best practices, how do you build these foundations the right way, and then how do you drive the right conversation at your company? Because the federal governments and the regulations are just not going to get down to that level of information. Right. And they are who matters. They're who are literally implementing AI, right? They control the data, the access, the quality, the models, the policy. It's the people in those fields. So that's what the association is basically a whole safe platform to help enable them to be supportive of each other and to drive the conversations and have the right skills and knowledge to do so.
That's really interesting. And it seems like it's been a gap in the industry for a long time. I know that data management in general has been one of these things where I felt like it's gone in fits and starts. I mean, there's some of the big organizations out there, which I won't name, but it seems to oscillate quite a bit in terms of the popularity and I think the stickiness in a lot of companies. I mean, my company, my experience is exactly the opposite of you. I don't work in big tech. Don't really want to work in big tech, but I work with, I guess, the 99% of the other companies, right? And it's like that. And every company, when I find it with data management, it seems to just be almost an utter hellscape. Like there's no standard practices. People are like, I don't know.
They don't understand what it is, right? People don't know what it is. And it's also been always deemed like as a cost center. So people don't want to invest in what they don't understand, or especially what they don't understand the value is to them, because the value sometimes may be amplified at a point like this, right? Now we're ready for AI. You can't really do it unless you did these things in the past, right? Like it's this continuous investment area that doesn't always show value immediately, but does as things evolve, right? Or strategies change. So good.
That's interesting, though. I mean, so you're forming a whole community around this, though, right? So I think it's a really cool take. Walk me through that. Like, what's been fun about it? What's been challenging?
Well, I think the challenging part is that we've been starting this from scratch, right? So I mean, community is about awareness. So, getting people to understand and getting the right PR that's out there, helping people to understand the value to them for joining. The other piece is actually getting to that value, right? We're starting something from scratch. So to get to a point where the forum, and I basically have to build a product to enable what it is that we want to provide, getting these things out and getting to a point where we've got people coming in and they're engaging one another, and discussions are starting to happen as we're building new features to get to the next steps, etc. It is challenging, just like it would be for any type of product. But on my perspective, I wish I could just go faster. I think that's the biggest challenge. Like, how can I get the news out? Like how can we make sure that, everyone's having conversations about AI within their companies and people are making investments. And if they're not having the right conversations with the right people in their companies about where they are and where their gaps are and where the risks would be, there's so much money that is going to be wasted and have to be redone from an investment perspective, or there's so much risk that people don't understand that they're taking that it's going to be very painful. I'll give you a stat, and I think there's a new number on this, but I know at least last year, the number was for companies that are trying to scale data within their organizations, think a big data type of analytics, like 90%, close to 90% of those fell. Okay. And out of those 90% of failures, almost 90% of the failures are blamed on culture. If
Interesting.
90% of analytics failures, if 90% of business analytics projects fell within companies, and AI is requiring the data that comes out of those particular things in order to actually, do the right generation, etc., then you're looking at least a 90% AI failure rate for Gen AI.
Hmm.
Okay, it's just the raw math. That's its food. That's its only food. Okay, and most companies and directors, boards of directors and executives don't understand those things and don't understand the cultural challenges, or again, those gaps in their foundations to support those cultural challenges are
Hmm.
needed. So I feel like, there's going to be a lot of AI heartbreak in regards to the investment that's going to be very wasted for multiple years.
Mm. We've been through a few of these before,
Yep.
so
It
that's
happens every
interesting.
time there's a new shiny thing, right?
It's almost like leap year.
Yeah.
So seems like you
Groundhog
usually
Day.
get these Groundhog Day for sure. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it's one of these things where I was traveling the world last year talking about this and sort of asking the question, if not now, when? Right? Like if we're not going to take this stuff that we've been whining about as an industry forever, data management, governance, ethics, all this stuff that we've been shouting from the rooftops for a long time, and everyone's like, yeah, that's cute. Can we just get AI or whatever the shiny new toy, blockchain, Web3? If we're not going to do it now, when it actually matters, when the focus and the attention's on it and the money's in there, then like when are we ever going to get this stuff right? Stuff
Yeah.
like data management, right? I think this
Yeah.
seems like it'd be the good time to do it, but what do I
It's
know?
I thought that with GDPR.
You
I really thought
did,
GDPR
yeah,
would be like, you have to now get it, right? Like you get major 20% fines if you don't understand your data. And to get to a dimension, you need to understand the rest of your data to get to a dimension. Well,
yeah,
that's not quite what happened. But again, it goes back to the regulations. The regulations do not get to the right layers of implementation
mm,
to actually implement these things to standardize and do the true protections that they need to do. And I would argue the vast majority of companies aren't GDPR compliant, even still today, right? They
oh
just
no,
did some check boxes and, they published a privacy policy, but, especially like in software, I'll give you an example. It's easy to, within your software itself, when you have your logs or your instrumentation, it's easy to make sure you're, not capturing any personal data, or hey, I can delete you, etc. But then that same data flows down into the software companies run the business applications and services for those software companies, and you know people didn't necessarily think about that when it came to GDPR readiness. They're thinking, I'm a software provider and I just have to enable the customer to, give configurations about what they want to do. Doesn't
mm-hmm.
matter about our run the business of it. And it's like, no, we have to do that too. You know what I mean? So
Right,
it's just, it's crazy. So again, AI, I think is hopefully it's the time, because AI, if you get it wrong, you'll be on the news. Okay. GDPR, if you got it wrong, you have to wait for the regulators to find that you got it wrong and then start to try to find you. And they're only going after the big guys. The little guys
yeah,
themselves can have a whole lot of customer complaints if their stuff goes wonky, you know what I mean, on their websites or their reactions, and a customer calls whoever, they'll know it a lot faster than
mm-hmm.
GDPR.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's going to be very fascinating. And just the sheer amount of content that's coming out too, AI generated is interesting. I think a mutual friend of ours, Sol Rashidi, a few weeks ago, I think an article was written generated about her family, and that was crazy to see.
I saw that about her husband. I know it's crazy. Well, again, it's scary. There's people aren't when they're putting in the generative AI services in their own infrastructure. Like a lot of companies are just kind of throwing it into production environments, not understanding how their environments are connected to other components within their production
Mhm.
environments and where it's flowing, right? Like back to what's your business strategy? What's
Yeah.
your data strategy? What's maturity? And what's your infrastructure? And where's it going? And what's it going to impact? And, you have to understand those things because, some people are going to fall apart overnight because of some of these mistakes. You know what I mean? Like their
Mhm.
business will be ruined potentially overnight because of some of these
Oh
mistakes.
yeah. It's going to be fascinating. And back to the association, real quick.
Yep.
So you say you're making a product and building community. I mean, these are like two full-time jobs.
Yeah.
Um, for how do you go about this? What do you prioritize first? Do you prioritize the community first, or the offering first? Like, what is
I would say I'm doing both, and let me explain how.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, I have another startup too. So I actually have two startups.
Oh, geez. Okay.
But let me explain. So again, I'm a community builder, right? Like as a data person, especially as a data executive, I have had to build communities for years and years and years. All that I'm doing now is I'm building community outside of a company, you know what I mean? Which
Yeah.
I've also done for years. So I have a whole crew of people that are supporting, right? That's the thing about community. Once you have a village, you have a village, and the village then starts to drive more village. Okay. So what we're doing is we're empowering people who understand the message, right? And understand the value of what it is that we're doing and see the need to go recruit, socialize, build chapters, host a session. What do you want to talk about? Do you want to talk about, quality? Do you want to talk about cyber? Do you want, what do you want to talk about in specific? Host it. We gave
Mhm.
you a whole forum so that you can bring people together who have shared mindsets like you on different topics. Because we're bridging silos, because that's what we're trying to do is we're bridging the silos within those disciplines. What tends to happen within companies is privacy sticks to privacy, or privacy
Mm.
might work more with the security team because usually the security team owns controls, right? Which you have then for privacy, but both kind of ignore the data teams. And the data
Right.
teams are actually where the problems are, right? When you're trying to protect. So
Mhm.
to actually, again, take something like the EU executive order, or to take something like, a GDPR next that's going to come, that's basically going to say you as a human have the right to opt in or opt out of ML processes. Maybe it's a diagnostic model in healthcare. Do you want your data to go in or not? Yes, no. You say yes. Going to have a configuration that says, okay, you opted in. Now, are you open to having your diagnostics delivered to you from a bot, or do
Mm.
you want that from a human? Those levels of configs are coming, and they can't just be a privacy piece of paper. That requires that data management layer, right? For you to actually know your data and your categorizations and all of that good stuff. And so we're trying to bridge silos so that as these regulations come out per silo, like the EO focusing on cyber, right?
Yeah.
That goes back into the data teams and everything else. So we can look at the pictures and the flows holistically, and we can actually start to optimize the investment on these regulations. And we can start to work together to shift data left in a data by design type of mentality to actually design for ethics, design
Mm.
for privacy, design for security. If you do that as you're implementing your data, you're mitigating a whole lot of your risk early on versus trying to catch the risk after it's already in production environments. Okay. And so we're trying to create that like knowledge share going back and forth, the conversations going back and forth, and the village themselves, they want to have it, right? Like you're a data guy. I'm sure AI, AI you're probably all the time be like, what does this mean? Or I want to gripe about why is the NIST missed the only call out in the executive order. Like that irritated the hell out of me, to be really honest. I was like, that is so wrong. But I'm like, those conversations need to happen, and they're not going to happen at the board. They're not going to happen with the 7 big companies on the hill, because their business models, they just want to support their tools,
Right.
their customers. The regulators don't understand it. It has to happen with us, the people who work in the fields. Okay. So I said, I just want to me, this is like the way you actually get quality and ethics is just by enabling people to talk who really haven't had the ability to talk in the past. Think also, we're going after college students. Okay.
Oh, good.
So think, STEM, right? All these younger kids coming out of college, STEM degrees. This is their future. This is their jobs. So number one, a dedicated forum, we can help them get jobs faster than anything else. Even LinkedIn right now, which has all these other disciplines, we could also ramp them in their fields much faster through, things like mentoring rings, etc. And again, some of these topical conversations, there's too many conferences that happen that people like you and I go to either listen or to speak, where you go, you see they spotlight some purple shiny flying unicorn that's not a reality, or actually took like 5 years and 15 failures to get to. Then you as an individual go back home and you're just like, I don't know what I took out of that I'm actually going to tactically do something within my own company. That's what I'm trying to change. Like, I'm trying to help people have tactical knowledge share, tactical experience of, I'm trying to solve this. How did you do it? And you get 5 responses that can take you through the steps because you do the actual role, right? Like, so I'm trying to improve, how that works. But back to, a village will build a village, and a village will fuel a village. You just got to get the village going. And the product enables the village. The more there is there that they can interact with, the more that they can use, the more that, we enable, self-service calendars, or the more we just produced our V1 of a marketplace. 3 marketplaces, but our first is around talent and jobs, right? Talent referrals to refer people in, and one for posting of jobs. It's right now a manual self-entry thing until we get to the automation pieces. But like, I have 2 people within the forum who raised their hand saying, I want to help with this. I'll manage this. I'll start adding things in. I'll scrape off of, LinkedIn or whatever. We've got people signing up for chapters. We've got people signing up to write for our newsletter. We've got a monthly newsletter. We've got a podcast that's coming out in February called Beyond Binary. And I'm not going to be the only host. We're going to let people host based on their own topics that they want to discuss. So, like, for me, I'm planning to actually dig into the human side of data, AI, and technology. And I want to talk about things like culture changes, not at companies, or things like, how does, archaeologists are using a lot of, AI in order to go and actually identify dig sites and, particular things like that. There's a whole impact related to languages and lost languages, and how we might be able to use voice AI to actually save those languages and kind of, re-innovate cultures where those things are dying, etc. Like, I'm really interested in the human impact side of these things versus here's a company that's going to make billions of dollars, off of their implementation piece. And so that's going to be a big part of our podcast and our pieces. But back to, things will build when you enable and empower people to have the right conversations and to learn from one another.
Yeah, it's definitely key to a community. It's you got to give people a space, like the psychological safety, to feel like they can do things too. So yeah, it's hard too. I mean, I've started communities myself, whether it's local communities, online communities, whatever. And I think the central thing is making sure people have a place to feel like they can give their best thoughts with the best people. It's and try not to get in people's way. I mean, it's hard. It's hard because when you start something, you also want to try and like have some sense of control over it and not have anarchy. But it's a big balancing act for sure.
Well, well, I think that's the big piece. The other piece is that, like, I keep saying we're bridging, like we're bridging silos, we're bridging this. We also want to bridge like other communities. Like, I'm like, there's
Yeah.
never, back to, there's not going to be one AI sheriff. There's not going to be one community. There's a million communities. So things like, think like the International Association of Privacy Professionals. I'm like,
Mm.
perfect. Can they come in and actually run our privacy deep track? We've got
Hmm.
a whole ethics council spinning up that's actually trying to focus on,
That's
again,
cool.
tactical implementation standards that meet regulations, and we're doing it by discipline, so cyber, privacy, etc. Can they come and run that? That's one less thing I have to do. I'd like the privacy experts to run that space, but you can't have privacy regulations or recommendations and not know how to implement it in your data, right? So we need to bring it in and actually then have the data people kind of augment or say, here's what you would actually do to implement this, or here's the suggestions that need to change, etc. So I want to bridge like communities, even like Chad's community, right? Chad's Slack community. I'm like,
Yeah.
I want everyone to know that Chad has a Slack community, because I don't want people to have to do a search or not engage with someone because they didn't know something existed. I want to help people understand what exists and gets connected to
Hmm.
the things that exist that interest them, to help them do whatever it is that they want to do. And that's kind of what the association is supposed to be about, is bridging all these things, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's a cold start problem, I would say, because every community it runs the chance of just being an island.
Yep.
Sort of. I mean, what kind of island would that be? The one wherever Napoleon was a prisoner in the middle of the Atlantic, I think it was.
No, Ira is something. Ira. Anyway, I know you're
Yeah,
talking
the one that's really lonely.
about.
That's most people's communities after a bit, and it's sad because I feel like you're hitting on something which is near and dear to me, which is the fact that as an industry we need to level up our knowledge and our skills. I think, as I've been ranting about, like, I don't think we have any shortage of great tools at this point. I think that
Right,
tooling is very much a solved problem for most use
right.
cases,
Yep.
but our ability to use those tools to the fullest potential, I'm horrified, to put it lightly, at our that we keep making the same mistakes over and over again as an
Yep.
industry.
Yep. Yep.
Why? But then you mentioned that, okay, 90% of these projects fail. 90% of those, the reason is cultural, yeah, it's
But
fascinating.
back to Groundhog Day, right? Like, we keep having the same conversations, but companies need to understand. Again, with AI, I think you have to shit or get off the pot when it comes to data, right? And again, data is not just a metric or an outcome. Like, there's a whole lot
Hmm.
of things underneath it that are related to it, and you have to understand your investments and the needs in order to leverage that, right, as an asset, or protect it as an asset. And it's not a one-time thing, it's a constant thing. Every time you have a new M&A acquisition, every time you add a new application, every time you add a new business app, or you add a new data set that comes in from a third party, every time you do anything, change your infrastructure, you're impacting the data. Every time
Hmm.
you change your strategy and want a new metric, like, all of these things are data changes.
Yeah.
and people just don't seem to understand that. So yeah, it's time to data down. It's time for us as individuals, especially like you and I as leaders in these fields, like, we need to do more to help the us's of the world, and to stop siloing into
Hmm.
our own jobs and our own pieces, etc., to share information and knowledge. And back to, like you said, about training and tools, right? You want to go learn Gen AI right now, you go and you type in a search, you get 5,000 responses back from a search engine. That's part of what I'm saying with, like, the association. We're trying to build these marketplaces so that you have one place to go to, and you can get that 5,000 through that one place, but you also get, Joe is a champion for this, and Joe gave it a 5.0 net promoter score, and he recommended XYZ.
Hmm.
We're trying to solve the time it takes from an investment to help self skill yourself. And
Yeah.
actually, again, kind of source that throughout the community on what's actually meaningful to each other as well. So
Doing the Lord's work.
it's
It's such a, we're in the same boat. It's I think it's seems like our crusades is just, I think, leveling up the our generation, the next generation, and it's
it is. It's a handoff, right? It's a handoff. I mean, the
yeah.
world is very different today than it was when I started my career in 1996, right? When I started my career, data evolution has majorly changed, and I've been there watching all of it, and at
Mhm.
some of the biggest data companies helping to drive some of these things, and like I know how to do some of these things that people don't necessarily know how to do. How do I
Yeah.
help others understand what is possible, right? And help arm them to do it. Sets them up for their careers and helps them, in regards to, helping their companies transfer and have impact. And it just seems like a win-win-win. And it's not
Mhm.
just me. So I've got a whole group of me. So there's probably about 20, 25 different chief data and AI officers involved in this right now. This is not about creating another executive forum. I think there's enough executive
There's
forums
a
that,
lot of
again,
them.
we still don't
Yeah.
learn very much that take away from. This is about actually executives starting to help their other employees underneath them come in and get more support and
Yeah. That's
impact.
necessary. Like I was at the Chief Data Officer Summit in Boston last month, and I don't really come from that world. I was just there, and it was interesting because I felt like, as I was listening to a lot of the chief data officers on the stage, it's like it felt like I was at a support group. Um,
They're all
so
saying the same thing. No, I know.
same
So,
stuff.
so it's kind of like a 12-step program. Every time you go to
Hmm.
one of the things, you're like,
Seems like it.
so part of my role at Tableau, when I moved into Tableau as their first chief data and AI officer, my role was not intended to be customer facing per se. Like my job was supposed to be doing the job, right, to help the company grow. But once it was announced, everybody wanted to meet with me because I'm them, right? So like there were more requests to meet with me than there were to meet with Mark Mendelson or products, etc. And they didn't want to talk Tableau. They wanted to talk all these choke points around data. And they're the same for all of us.
Hmm.
Things like back to, people aren't doubling down on data. Like I don't have dedicated funding envelopes to do the data job. Okay. And so I just can't scale the organization. Lack of talent, balancing, offensive, offense data and monetization or grow the business with defense needs. The politics of data. Data is the most political job that there is of all the C-suites.
Mm.
We enable everyone. Data is not a real thing that flows across everybody's processes, and they all have different priorities, and we have no real accountability usually, right? We don't
Hmm.
own the business process. We're a support. We're a support servant to the business, and one where the data is supposed to be used to help improve the business processes and and automations, etc. But we have very little influence into the business teams often to actually do that, and it becomes political because people don't like change, right? And other things, very political. So all the conversations with chief data and AI officers are all the same. They're all the same. It doesn't matter if it's a 100-person company or it's a 100,000-person company, or
Hmm.
if it's a software or if it's a fintech or if it's healthcare or retail. It's all the same. It's
All the same.
all the same. So
Wendy, it's been great having you on the show. So, for people who want to learn more about you and what you're up to, or the association, how can they do that?
yeah, I think so. Of course, I'm on LinkedIn. You can find both these things right off of my LinkedIn page. You can go to the website itself, the Association.ai, space. And I'm happy, of course, to answer any questions. They can message me, and I'm happy to chat.
Awesome. Well, it's great
Yeah,
chatting with you. So,
thank
good
you,
luck, and
Joe.
we'll
It
talk
was a
soon.
pleasure.
Awesome, as always. All right.